Hello, this is the lesson video for lesson 2.02 Evolution and Populations. So previously we talked about adaptations and how that was involved in evolution, and today we're going to look how evolution occurs in populations. So right here it says evolution occurs in a population where its genetic makeup, or you could just think of this as genes, changes over time. And remember, a change over time, that's how we defined evolution. Okay, so we're looking at how a population's genetic makeup changes over time. So we're going to be looking at two questions. One of the questions are, how do organisms become adapted to their environment? Last lesson we talked about what adapted means, and adapted, remember, is a characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce, making them fit for their environment. The second question we're going to be looking at is, what must have happened in the past to give rise to species that fit well into their environment? So we're going to look at possible things that might have happened in order for organisms to actually be adapted to their environment. But before we start all that, it's important for you to know a good definition for population. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in a shared space and reproduce with one another. Okay, so there are three different types of criteria, right? One is that they're the same species. Two is that they live in the same area, they share space. And three is that they reproduce. Okay, so we see here that those are three characteristics of a population. It's really important to remember that throughout this lesson. So an example is that if we look right here, this is an example of a reef community. So there are many things. We have coral right here. We have different types of fish. And obviously other types of organisms in this area. However, a population, remember, has to be the same species in the same space, and they have to reproduce. And so the coral that we see right here is not the same population as the butterfly fish that we see right here. Okay, the reason why is because they're not the same species. So a population that we see in this picture, you could say, is the population of butterfly fish. All of the butterfly fish that reproduce with one another in this area would be part of the same population. If we were to go another 50 kilometers away, right, so in another area, we would find another population of coral or another population of butterfly fish, and the reason why we would consider it a different population is because they're in a different space. Okay, so just remember these three characteristics of a population. Okay, so when we look at a population, we also look at its gene pool, which are the total of all the genes for all traits in a population. Okay, so that's another important word you're going to need to know, gene pool. So if you look at this this picture right here, let's say we're looking at the population for this butterfly fish. If we were to look at all of the genes at the butterfly fish and all of the different versions of each of their genes, then we would have their gene pool. Okay, so if you were to, so it says here, if you were to have 237 golden butterfly fish in the population, then if you were to consider all of the different traits that they have, then if we compile all that together, we would have the gene pool for the butterfly fish in that population. Okay, so that means that it includes all the different alleles for each type of gene. And if you remember from Biology A, we talked about alleles and how they are different versions of a gene. So for example, if we had like the eye color gene, right, different alleles would be like green, blue, brown, etc. Okay, so again, we're looking at the gene pool has all the different possible alleles for each type of gene. So here's an example that they give. Some of the fish might have an allele for medium black mass size, right? They're talking about this thing right here, right? While others would have the large one. So those are two different versions of a gene or two different alleles. So in the gene pool, we would consider both of those. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how evolution can occur. And the best way to do this is to kind of think about one particular population. So we're going to be looking at this made-up example of these arc-crested fruit dove, which is right here. Okay, and what we're going to be focusing on is are these bright feathers that these doves have. So we're going to be looking at these birds. They live in an island called Hoi Polloi, and basically the island has a lot of different colorful tropical birds. They didn't really have any major predators, which means that they just lived in peace and they didn't need to worry about anyone eating them. And so you could see that these birds had these beautiful colorful feathers. If we were to look at the gene pool, right, remember, which is the total genes with all the allele, of this population, it would have the genes for, or the alleles for, like purple feathers, green feathers, etc. Okay, before we go over this, I want to just go over the difference between phenotypes and genotypes. Okay, so remember, an allele is a version of a gene. We just went over that. Some other important words you need to know are the words genotype and phenotype. So remember, genotype are the alleles that an individual has for a specific trait. Whereas the phenotype would be the physical appearance. So what we see with our eyes. So phenotype would be what we see with our eyes, and genotype would be actually the alleles. An important fact about the genotype is, remember, you always have two different alleles, because one comes from your dad, and then one comes from your mom. So an example of something would be like if you had big B, little b, maybe you got the big B, a dominant feature, from dad, and a recessive feature from mom. Okay, so that would be a genotype, always having two letters or two alleles. Okay, so when we look at these birds here, we see some differences. We see some that have green feathers and others that have purple feathers. And so there are differences between these birds. And it says right here that variation existed. Variation meaning differences. And that's really important. For evolution to occur, there must be some sort of difference in the population. So if we were to look and see which one was dominant and which one was recessive, we're going to say that the big F, right, or the dominant is the purple, and the little f, or the recessive, would be the green feathers. Okay, so that means that the purple ones right here could be big F, or big F, little f, because this one is dominant. Whereas the green ones here would always be little f, little f. And we're going to say that the ratio of all these alleles in this population was 1 to 1. And what that means is that there is an equal amount of big F, dominant F, and little f, or the allele for purple and the allele for green. However, even though we started out, right, in the beginning we started out with a 1 to 1 ratio, that ratio of alleles are not fixed, which means that they're not permanent. They can change, okay? So how do they change? So it turns out that as long as there are no changes in the environment, the ratio of alleles for feather colors will never change. So again, we see here, if there are no changes in the environment, the alleles for the feather color will never change. So obviously the only way for the ratio of alleles to change is for there to be some sort of change in the environment. And so what we see here is we see an equal amount, right? We see that the amount for allele F and the amount for allele big F are the same amount. That's our 1 to 1 ratio. However, if we introduce a change in the environment, that ratio can change. Okay, but let's see, if we introduce a new variable, right, a new predator, someone who eats the birds, into the habitat, how does that change our allele ratios? So let's say that this snake came in and was introduced by some lumber ships that brought them onto the island. It really changes the entire ecosystem. Okay, so again, this introducing a new predator is changing the environment, which remember we said if we change the environment, that's going to change the allele ratios. So we see here that this new snake have found its new prey, or things that it eats, and one of them are the birds. Okay, so the snake begins hunting down the victims, and they fell as easy prey because they had no defenses against the snake. They had no defenses. So which bird was more susceptible to being caught prey by the snake? Remember that the purple crested ones were more easily seen, whereas the green crested individuals could camouflage, right? Which means it was eaten less often. So this means that the green ones had a higher chance of survival, which means it had a higher chance for reproduction. And remember, last lesson we talked about adaptations. If something helps you survive and reproduce, we consider it an adaptation. So these green feathers have now become an adaptation. So as the years go by, there are fewer of one kind of phenotype than the other. Remember, this is the physical appearance. So it's saying there's one of them become more common than the other. So we see that these brown tree snakes began eating these purple crested fruit doves one by one, and there are fewer and fewer of them surviving. So that means that there are fewer and fewer of them reproducing. So this big F allele, right, this version of the gene began to decrease, right? If they're not reproducing and passing on their genes, then the allele frequency is going to decrease. So over time, even though we started off with a ratio that was 1 to 1, it soon became 1 to 1.5, 1 to 2.5, 1.3, then 1 to 4, 1 to 9, etc. So for every one big F allele, we saw, for example, 9 little f's. So this one is becoming more common. Okay, so we see here, it's eventually this one, this little f, the amount is going up, and the big F is going down because those purple birds are not reproducing. So we see it gradually happening, right? Till at the end, we have very little f and a lot of, very little big F and a lot of the little f. So we're going to see many more green birds. So what happens is the population has changed. Remember, population are organisms that have the same species in the same shared space that reproduce with one another. Before we saw equal amounts of green and purple, but now the population's different. So as the allele frequency has changed, or how common the alleles are, so did the percentages of the two kinds of fruit doves in the population. So because there were less alleles, there's less big F's, right? There were less purple birds. The reason why this happened was because they were less likely to survive and reproduce, so they weren't able to pass on their genes to their offspring, but the green-crested individuals were able to. So clearly what happened here was evolution. Evolution alters the gene pool, and remember, the gene pool has the total alleles, right, for all the genes for a population. And so evolution, or this change that we saw in the bird population, clearly changed what genes were in the gene pool and what alleles were in that gene pool. Okay, so kind of the conclusion of the story was after 100 years there were no more purple birds, right? And the brown tree snakes were unable to find the green-crested fruit doves, so there were more of those. So it is apparent that having a green crest or those feathers is an adaptation, right? Because remember, it's the survival and reproduction that allowed the fruit doves to be more fit, right? Which again means survive and reproduce, to live in their environment. Having a purple crest made the fruit doves unfit for the snake-infested island. Reason why? They were not able to survive and reproduce. Okay, so this shows that the arc-crested fruit doves of hoi polloi came to look, how the arc-crested fruit doves of hoi polloi came to look like they do. So now what we would see are all of these green birds, and it's not because there were green birds always, it's because of this, the change in the environment changed the makeup of the island. And because we have that change in allele frequency in the gene pool, we consider that evolution, which remember is a change over time. Okay, so that obviously was a fictional example. Here are some examples of that have actually occurred. And so if we were to look at the Pacific island of Guam, we would see these two birds right here. Okay, and these two birds are in two totally different situations. The first one is the fruit dove that has a lot of different colors, and so obviously it would be an easy target for the brown tree snake. And so they actually are facing extinction, or if not, have already been extinct because we have not seen them since 1984. And that's because they are defenseless, right? And defenseless means they cannot defend themselves against the predators. Whereas these herons right here, we see it has a very large beak, right? Because of that large beak, it's able to defend itself against that brown tree snake, allowing this bird to survive and reproduce. So that's its special adaptation to allow it to continue to survive and reproduce. Okay, so the summary for this lesson, we learned that evolution is a change, right? And it's a change specifically in the genetic makeup or the gene pool, right? And because we change, we have a change in that gene pool, we have a new genetic makeup. So the population looks different. Okay, so evolution changes how the population looks. Okay, so here's some important vocabulary. We have evolution, the change in allele frequency in a population's gene pool. We have population. Remember, it has 3 characteristics. It must be the same species that live in the same shared space and reproduce with one another. We have the gene pool, all the genes from all the individuals in a population. An allele is a version of a gene. And then we have allele frequency, how common an allele is in a population. That is usually expressed in a percentage.